All right, just a quick little background and why I'm involved here. I'm talking less as a Googler and more as a participant in some cross-industry efforts around managed application configuration. But I do want to make sure that everybody understands this is not just an Android thing, not even just an Android and iOS thing. This is an effort that has got legs and will eventually go places that I think will be valuable to everyone that needs to use an EMM, Enterprise Mobility Management platform for any mobile, or even it's starting to show up in desktop, for purposes of taking an application and giving it managed configuration from a source of policy, right? I'm going to start and zero in on the mobile side because that's where the history of this came from. There's a process that users hate and enterprises hate, and it used to be that we'd force the end users to go in and manually configure things like, I think the one that everybody hated the most was, how do I get an Exchange account on my Exchange client, right? I'm showing the Gmail one as an example. There was lots of information you have to put in. As an end user, it's a pain to find out what the exact information is. The enterprise doesn't know for sure if the end user has properly followed all the instructions, and even worse, if the enterprise is managing the application or managing the container or device, they don't know for sure even that the account that they want the user to put in has actually been provisioned. I think a really good example of the risk here is what happens if an end user provisions their personal box or Dropbox account inside or even Office 360 inside the application that's running all the other enterprise apps and data, and all of a sudden they've got this easy way of taking those documents and putting them right into their cloud accounts. And the enterprise went through the whole process of locking that down for purposes of not allowing that flow to exist, right? So what used to be there was really painful. The process didn't really make for a user-friendly setup. And what we began to see about 5 years ago, the first one that I'm aware of was NitroDesk Touchdown, where they created a special set of APIs and an SDK that allowed enterprise mobility management partners to provision the user Exchange configuration without the end user having to be aware of what was going on. Now, it was kind of secure by obscurity, but at least it was a beginning, right? And the problem was this wasn't scalable. If every enterprise app that had something that needed to be configured did their own special SDK, and EMMs then had to implement on their clients, dozens and now hundreds and maybe thousands of these special SDKs, it just wouldn't work. So what we started seeing, starting in iOS 7, there's a key value pair-based solution that was in a plist that's called Managed App Configuration. Only an enterprise mobility management partner could access this API. That was the very first time this showed up in an OS. Then a very similar functionality called app restrictions, we now refer to it as managed app or managed configuration on Android. The APIs are still app restrictions. The reason why we've changed the nomenclature is that a lot of people misunderstood that the app restrictions themselves governed policy, when in fact all we were doing is passing configurations that the developer had to give meaning to. So In the Android case, not only strings, but also int and Boolean types, and there's even now a bundle type, but there's some complication around that. We don't think people should be using that quite yet. The benefits are pretty simple. Developers can now have a single interface that they expose to their customers through enterprise mobility management partners. In other words, the EMMs are able to receive this, and I'll explain how that happens, configure this, whatever settings, right? If you're a developer, you decide what are the settings that need to be configurable in your app. Enterprises get to have that additional level of provisioning, and to the degree that there's policy involved in that configuration control. I'll talk a little bit about what's appropriate and what's not, because sometimes if there's a SaaS service involved on the back end, that's the best place to manage policy. But until that user has logged in, this is the only opportunity that you would have to configure that application. And then for end users, things just magically work. They open the app, and when you combine this with AppAuth, as William showed in his slides, now you have the opportunity to have a very clean, almost magical experience where the very first time in a managed application environment, you click on that app as an end user and everything just works. So let me drill down a little bit to what's going on. The pattern is pretty straightforward. So the app developer has to implement define what, and think of this in terms of schema. The app developer says, here are my managed configuration schemas. These are the things that are configurable in my app. The admin within the EMM console, so the customer configures those, and in the background, of course, the EMM has implemented the capabilities of configuration, capability of discovery, so that they understand what the configurable parameters are and whatnot. That's all hidden from the end user. Then that's communicated down on the device to the agent application. In Android, we call this device policy controller. And then that's communicated through the OS to the application, which gets the configuration silently. So on iOS, this is available for managed applications with an enterprise mobility management solution. It works for both enterprise and educational customers. There's a dictionary that gets pushed down with these key value pairs, and there's an ability of receiving information about success, failure, or even some ability to get error messages, very specific error messages from the app developer back. And so the EMM can then query that. This is something that's been available since iOS 7, and there's some sample code published here. Feel free to take a look at it. It's very easy to implement. For Android, there's a few differences. Android for work is required. So that's either a managed profile, where you're running separate personal and work instances on the same device, or a managed device altogether. The key, and you'll see this test DPC on the demo video that I'm going to show. This is just an example that lets you as an app developer set managed configuration and receive it so that you can test that. But this makes it really easy for you to play around with managed configuration on Android. There's also a GitHub repository for this that you can use to, if you're an EMM, to set up the code for managing locally the app restrictions. And then the same code lab that William mentioned in the last session, and I've got a link to it here. If you go to the end of that code lab, you'll see that there's some managed configuration that we're using to pass the login hint in that test or in that sample app, that allows you to see exactly how you would do the identity integration. So let's look really quickly at the schema. It's relatively straightforward. You've got a key, you've got a title so that you can, and you're going to connect that to a string. So you want to be able to give the EMM what they need to paint the picture for the admin of, what is this thing that I want to be configurable. You define the restriction type. In this case, we're showing a Boolean. And then a description that can be used. In other words, the EMM, when the admin hovers over that box when they're configuring, they're going to need to understand what is it that they are configuring. So that's brought in here. And then you can suggest a default value if it makes sense, so that it's pre-filled on the admin screen. And relatively straightforward. So in order to understand how all the pieces come together on this, I've got this diagram. The enterprise mobility management supplier is using an API to be able to query what these schema are directly from Google Play, because of course we've got those schema from each Android app has the schema in their manifest. What's going to happen then at the EMM server is they're going to set up the display of that configuration for the enterprise admin, who then gives the EMM the necessary information to configure that for individual users, groups, devices, etc. That gets pushed from the EMM server to the EMM client on the device, which makes calls to the Android framework. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But it's basically just setting the application restrictions using this call down here. And as soon as that happens, that gets sent, the restrictions get sent to the app. There's a little bit more logic involved in this. First of all, if an application is being installed for the first time at the user's request, and the EMM wasn't already aware that that app was coming, there's an opportunity for a race condition that we want to avoid. So we've got this restrictions pending thing that will allow the EMM to say, hang on, don't do anything, app, until I've given you the app restrictions. That helps prevent confusing user experiences. Once that's happened, then the app proceeds as usual. Generally, you're not going to see that problem in practice. If the app is not if the app has not seen anything yet, then it's going to register for a broadcast and continue on unless the EMM is told it that the restrictions are coming, right? Otherwise, it gets the restrictions, it configures them, and it continues on. Okay, let's switch over to the demo. I'm going to walk through how this works on a, you got the video ready? We just have to switch to a different source. Yep, on the second tab there. Perfect. So what you're going to be seeing is I'm using test DPC in this case. Normally that's not happening on device. You can see Gmail does not have any accounts configured yet. So we're opening up test DPC. Normally this would happen as your admin would do this on the EMM console. We're doing this all locally just for purposes of showing app restrictions. So we're setting up the various configurations for Exchange on the Gmail app. So we're going to paste in some accounts. We're going to paste in the Exchange server information. All of these you can think of as what the admin would be doing on the EMM console. The test DPC lets you play around with these locally. So if you're an app developer, you don't have to go through a whole major installation of an EMM solution. So we're just about done setting the various values that the app is going to need in order to configure this account. Okay, they've now been set. You saw that little toast show up. So we're opening Gmail, and momentarily it will be ready for, there we go. So it's picked up the account now, and all it needs is a password. That's the only thing we haven't supplied. So all the user has to do is type in the password, and in just a moment, we'll see that there's the account, and we'll click on the account, and we'll see that it's all provisioned. We're getting messages, and from an end user perspective, the only thing the end user has had to do here is type their password. When they open Gmail for the first time, they will get that prompt. They'll put that password in, and then we'll from that point forward. Of course, it's syncing right now, and now we're sending email. So we can switch back over. But that's just a simple example of app restrictions in action using the Gmail app. This is using a relatively new capability in Gmail. So if you want to be able to, as an enterprise, configure Gmail as an Exchange client, that's all supported through app restrictions now. And if you're using an EMM that supports it, you can take advantage of that managed configuration capability. All right, let's go back to the presentation and we'll continue. Yep. So what is the value of standardizing how managed configuration is done? There's a whole lot of history here in terms of app developers saying, wouldn't it be good if what we do in terms of configuration parameters is a little more standardized so that we're not having to tell every customer in detail how to configure our application. And so there was an effort that was started by AirWatch. It actually dates back a little bit earlier than 2015, but 2015 is when ACE launched, and a lot of application development partners, it was kind of the first attempt to create this cross-platform standardization, and AirWatch got a lot of partners involved. In 2016, more enterprise mobility management partners were brought in. MobileIron, Maz360, and Jamf were part of that founding set when AppConfig launched. It's now got even more developers involved. It's a very large community, and let's go ahead and I'd encourage you to take a look at their website. There's something called DevCenter, which as an application developer, you can get a lot of information on what AppConfig managed configuration requirements and recommendations would apply to you, how you can take advantage of that, and how you can make your apps simpler to configure, secure, and deploy. Here's a quick summary of what the reasons are you might want to join and where to go to join. The Dev Center, and the reason I'm highlighting this is this enables you to solve the same kinds of problems on both platforms, right? How do you enable single sign-on cleanly across both iOS and Android apps? How do you provide similar security policies? How do you deal with configuration, per app VPN? All these questions. Now, you might remember this diagram from William's deck. This very first step is where app configuration comes in. If you are able to pass the login hint to the app, you don't need to throw an account chooser up in front of that user. All the user needs to do is sign in, and if they've previously signed in, it's just about a no-op at this point, because you can take advantage of app auth patterns with WebSSO to make that completely transparent if you're doing it on custom tabs. There's a number of other identity efforts underway. Want to put a shout out for those that are interested. We're wanting to attack a problem that's existed for a little while, namely how does an identity provider know that a particular app is under managed configuration, right? Today, the IDP just doesn't have that signal. We believe that the combination of app auth patterns and AppConfig will provide a clean method of doing this. We're getting a group together to work out the important best practices there. I've got a room, it's actually, I just found out this morning, we're going to be in Bacchus on the 4th floor on the river tower side, and encourage anyone that's interested to join us. Look for more identity-related capabilities coming from the AppConfig org and those who are participating there. And now let's jump into Q&A.
Any questions?
Of those in this room, how many are using any kind of managed configuration with their mobile apps today? Any platform? Roughly half. Okay.
Andy, did I see right that Android required an EMM agent, iOS didn't?
No, it's required on both.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, if you think about it, the whole point of managed configuration is that you have a source of truth for that configuration. And if you have kind of a free-for-all, it kind of defeats the purpose of doing managed configuration in the first place.
Do you want to briefly talk about that attestation model? What's implied or what's involved?
So the main idea here is if the EMM is able to prove by giving or well, I guess the better way of putting it is the app is able to prove by getting something from the EMM and then pass on through headers to the IDP that the IDP can verify, then the IDP can then say, oh, okay, I can make my authentication decision based on the fact that I know this app is actually managed by an EMM and not just sitting out there on a device that I know nothing about.
So we have a lot of customers asking for that integration, that insight into the app or the device as part of login. So it's
absolutely.
Valid.
This is something we've heard a lot about over the last year, and now that combination of the app auth pattern with using standardized AppConfig gives us a way to link together those best practices in a way that'll get us there.
Right. The next step would be beyond merely, quote unquote, a flag of managed would be, additional insight into what's going on the device.
Exactly, and there's an opportunity to take that further. I think this is the initial bootstrap that we want to solve the number one pain point in a way that everyone can adopt, and from there, there's obviously more information that we think could follow that flow.
Any question for Andy?
So I have a related question. So with the Chrome tabs and view controller and AppConfig efforts, is the NAPS working group still active, or is that completely gone?
The short answer is IoT, right?
Yeah, theoretical. So the question is, NAPS was attempting to address the native single sign-on, and is it still functioning? No, the value of NAPS was almost completely diminished by the new custom tabs. So there's speculation that model of a token agent might be relevant to devices, IoT. If you can't get a device, a token yourself, rely on a token agent to do so. Speculation at this point. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thanks.